Barry, the question on your sheet is what will drive your continued success moving forward. Could you also talk about, is it an easy place for you in Northern Nevada to be a manufacturer? And can we expect that other businesses with your model could be attracted to Northern Nevada, or has IGT been located here and you've adapted?
Let me give you a little perspective and maybe add a little
Move
color.
your microphone just a little bit closer there if you can. Yeah. Perfect.
Maybe I could add a little color to that. As I mentioned in my opening comments, at IGT, we certainly have been working hard to reduce labor and reduce costs and to improve our ability to manufacture products in Reno and distribute them to our customers economically. And I commented that producing a highly configured product was very expensive, and we will continue to do that. But to that very point, we have been researching and looking at to what would it take to be able to maintain our competitiveness and produce a product here. And we believe that the essence of making something like that work means focusing on a final characterization of the product, maybe starting with some kind of a basic platform or somewhat of a standardized base, and then configuring that maybe with selected options towards the back end to in essence find that compromise where we get the kind of the best of both worlds, where we get the standardization in production to where we can build the item effectively, and then secondly, with the ability to characterize it. The other thing that goes with that, and for those folks that work in the warehousing sector, I mean, we certainly know that every time we touch a part, there's a cost involved. And as I mentioned, in our current model, we're touching 250 to 350, sometimes even more, pieces of things in order to put them together to make a slot machine. When you're touching that many pieces, the only way it makes perfect sense is with an enormous economy of scale. In essence, you'd have to be building a lot of units of the same thing to where you can go and pick a high quantity of each of those 300 parts to build the game. With the variability that we're seeing in a current marketplace, we have to find a way where we're not touching as many parts as often as we are. So common sense would tell you that leads more towards maybe some kind of sub-assembly put together to make a final assembly type model. So do I believe manufacturing has a future here? I think it does. I think particularly when you're positioning your business model to be closer and more responsive to the customer, it does make sense. But what does not make sense is to take expensive labor and touch an inordinate number of pieces more times than you need to. Because when you start creating a business model like that, you're kind of kidding yourself. I mean, because the reality is we're competing against a world economy. And you know, we're all, I think, only starting to see, you know, the full impact of what a global economy feels like. Because Russ commented earlier that the one thing we have learned in the last certainly 15 years that I've been at IGT is that from Reno, we can ship pretty much anything we want to anywhere. There are a lot of possible ways to get things out of Reno to customers all over the world. Now, the one thing that's kind of tough, if somebody says, I want to overnight this thing to Beijing, well, that's kind of tough, you know, because we can't really overnight it to Beijing because we've got a lot of time difference there. But the reality is we can get things into hands of customers almost all over the world from Reno just as easily as you could if you were in Memphis or Louisville or any other place that's heavy into distribution. The only thing that changes a little bit is maybe cutoff time for departures. But the reality is the same infrastructure is there. And also too, I also wanted to comment that when you look at the resources available to a company like IGT, and candidly it's available to everybody, we contract all of our movements of freight. We don't see ourselves in the business of owning trucks. And racks of warehousing and things like that. We're more in the business of focusing on contracting what we need where we need it. Because the reality is, even if I did own trucks, they would always be in the wrong place. Because when you look at the business of IGT, we produce in a typical year, this last year we produced over 68,000 slot machines. We brought back to Reno over 38,000 slot machines that were recovered as trade-ins and fixed asset removals. Those are the mega jackpot type games. And of those games that we brought back to Reno, over 15,000 of those were, in essence, scrapped and recycled, where we took the metal and it was sent to a yard where it was crushed and smelted into new metals, and the monitors were crushed and melted into new glass and things of that nature. So when you look at the business of IGT, no doubt we have been in a downsizing mode. We've been in a mode of focusing on improving the business model. I clearly think we have a future here. I clearly think that Reno is a market that is conducive to manufacturing, but you have to be sensitive to the fact that one of the things that we kind of ran up against in this last few years is really the cost of labor. When you start looking at, and that's certainly going to continue to be an item anywhere, but when you start looking at cost of labor, I mean, if we're taking $15 an hour labor to do an activity where you can purchase labor at a lesser price elsewhere, you've got to question which portion of the activities do you want to put your $15 an hour labor on, and what can you afford to do? And then you have to make some decisions in the supply chain as to what's best done where to make the whole model make sense. And clearly, at the end of the day, what really makes that decision is, what's the impact to the customer? What's the customer going to pay for the price? Because for those of you that have studied the accounting classes, you know that price is not a function of cost. Price is a function of the market. So just because you won't make money on a deal doesn't mean somebody else is going to pay for it. I mean, so when you start looking at your labor costs, you've got to really ask yourself, at what portions of the supply chain should these pieces of work best be performed? And that answers a lot of questions for you. The other thing I wanted to comment on, someone asked the question to Dan about digital distribution. And I'm not quite sure, what perspective you were speaking from, but one thing I can tell you about, for example, with regard to a slot machine, we've reached the day and age where the software can be decoupled from the slot machine. In the old days, when we shipped a slot machine, it was kind of plug and play. Customer would get the machine, plug it into the wall, and turn it on, and it would boot up. Today, we still ship machines like that, but today we can certainly ship a slot machine with the software uninstalled on the machine.